In this video, we're going to talk about mutes. There's a lot to talk about mutes. I'm going to introduce you to each of the types of mutes in a standard trumpeter's mute bag, what they sound like, and how we use them. This is going to be the first of a three-part series because we're also going to talk about trombone mutes in part 2, and then in part 3 I'm going to show you how I use them to orchestrate my jazz band. But before I get into any of that, you know what I'm going to ask for. Hit subscribe, smash that like button, ring the bell icon. That does something. If you're enjoying these videos and getting a lot out of them, think about supporting me on Patreon. Your support has kept me going for months. I didn't think I was going to make this many tutorial videos, but here we are. I'm answering your questions. You asked about mutes, and I'm answering it. Before I get into talking about each mute individually, I'm going to talk about 5 different mutes. And these are the mutes, as a trumpeter, and I am a trumpeter, these are the 5 mutes that you can pretty much depend on any jazz band trumpeter worth their salt having in their mute bag that they take to pretty much any rehearsal or gig. And on that note, I'm not going to be talking about some of the more corner case mutes, like a solo tone mute. Most professional trumpeters have collected some of these more specialized mutes, and if you ask them in advance, they're happy to bring like a solo tone mute along to the rehearsal. But it's not going to be in the bag that they just bring by default. And these by default mutes are really the ones that we care about when talking about arranging for big band. So if you understand how each of the mutes I'm going to talk about sound and how they fit into the ensemble, you're going to be almost the entire way toward being an expert at writing for trumpet mutes. So these 5 mutes that we're talking about are straight mute, cup mute, harmon mute, bucket, and plunger. Now for each of these types of mutes, there's a ton of different brands and varieties. The harmon mute is kind of the wildest one. You have these big Joe Rao bubble mutes, you have the original harmon, you've got heavyweight copper mutes, but most of the differences in these types of mutes available are really something that only the trumpeter themselves is going to care about. Which notes are in tune and which notes they have to tune up with moving slide positions. And what the specific harmon mute characteristic is. That's going to be a personal choice for the player, and you really shouldn't concern yourself with that as the arranger. The most basic mute. This is, among the standard mute bag mutes, this is the one that's actually used the least in the jazz ensemble, and that's the straight mute. In fact, if you see a piece of music that just says muted, the trumpeter will grab their straight mute and stick that in their horn because muted means straight mute, as opposed to one of the more specific mutes. Straight mute sounds like this. The next mute you should really have an understanding of, and is one of the more commonly used in jazz ensemble music, is the cup mute. It has a bit of a more mellow sound than the straight mute, but it has its own character. This is what the cup mute sounds like. The harmon mute is probably the jazziest sounding of the mutes. This is the mute that when somebody says, I want you to sound like Miles Davis, they mean stick that harmon mute in. Miles was famous, especially late Miles, for playing with a harmon mute with no stem. And for that reason, when you see harmon, or when you write harmon on the part, it's assumed that they'd remove the stem. In fact, I can't even show you what the stem looks like because I lost mine years ago. That's how infrequently the stem is used. Don't write for harmon mute with stem in unless you plan on calling each of your trumpeters before the rehearsal or session, reminding them to bring their stem, because that's not really considered a standard part of the mute bag. That said, let's hear what harmon sounds like. the most subtle of the mutes, but also perhaps one of the most beautiful to me, is the bucket mute. And really, it's cumbersome, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about how to write for mutes. But the bucket mute has the effect, it sounds kind of like playing trumpet into a pillow. Like you lose a lot of the sort of high frequency, shimmery part of the sound and are left with just kind of a mellow trumpet sound. Here's how a bucket mute sounds. The last standard mute in a trumpeter's mute bag is the plunger. Now, a lot of mute manufacturers make a plunger, but most trumpeters that I know use an actual plunger bought at the hardware store. That's what I have. This is a regular hardware store plunger with the handle unscrewed and thrown away years ago. This is what a plunger sounds like. So now you're familiar with each of the 5 mutes. The sixth bonus mute, I guess, is the flugelhorn itself. The instrument flugelhorn is kind of used in the same way that other trumpet mutes are used, as sort of an alternate color that the trumpeter is supposed to be capable of producing. So here is how that same melody sounds on flugelhorn. So let's talk about some practical considerations for writing mutes into your parts. The mute has to be inserted into the trumpet and removed after they're done playing the passage that has the mute. So that takes a little bit of time. So you can't specifically have a trumpeter playing and then, 1 or 2 beats later, they're playing with the mute in. That's just literally impossible to do in a live setting. So what you end up doing is building in maybe a 4 or an 8 bar rest, depending on what tempo your piece is, for that mute change to happen. Some mutes take longer to set up than others. The Harmon mute, because of its shape, doesn't stick into the bell as well as the other mutes. So a trumpeter learns to breathe warm air into their bell before sticking the mute in, and that helps it stick into there. But of course, that takes a little bit of extra time to set up. A switch from no mute to Harmon mute takes longer than switching from no mute into, let's say, cup mute. The slowest mute transition is putting on the bucket mute. In fact, several manufacturers over the years have come out with their own versions of the bucket mute that attach more quickly than the standard Humes&Berg bucket mute. I don't have one of those to show you, but this mute, the Humes&Berg white and red mute that I showed you earlier, is the most common bucket that you will run into, that trumpet players will bring. It's inexpensive and it sounds really, really good, but it has the disadvantage of taking a long time to clip onto your bell or to remove. So if you want a trumpeter switching to bucket, leave them lots of rest. So how do you notate the mute switch? This is kind of it's something that I've seen done incorrectly so many times, I thought it was worth mentioning. By default, the trumpet is going to be playing with no mute, unless you tell them to play with a mute. The proper way to notate it on your part, right over the last note that they play open before the mute change, write 2, whatever mute it is. So 2 straight, if you want them to go to the straight mute. Then, there could be 32, 64 bars of rest, it doesn't matter. At the beginning of their next passage, where they're supposed to have their mute in, straight or straight mute above their first notes that they're playing with the mute. Then, at the end of whenever you want them to have the mute in, write 2 open, and then over the first passage where they're playing with no mute in again, write open above it. That makes it very clear when they're supposed to put their mute in and take it out, and gives them lots of warning. When someone's sight reading, if you don't write 2 Harmon above the last phrase before they're supposed to go to harmon mute. When they're sight reading, they might not scan ahead and notice that after their 64 bars of rest that they're supposed to have the harmon mute in. So they'll be sitting there, you know, making jokes with the other trumpet players or something, whatever they do during their 64 bars of rest. And then a couple bars before they're supposed to play, they'll pick up their trumpet and realize they're supposed to have harmon mute in, and then they scramble. But you could avoid that by just writing 2 harmonies. The act of playing through a mute changes the characteristic of playing on the trumpet. Mutes tend to make the trumpet sharp. Most good trumpeters understand how each mute affects their pitch, but it is a consideration. So if you're having them switch to straight mute, which tends to make the trumpet sharp, they're going to adjust for it. But if you have them switching to straight mute for 4 bars and then back to open and then back to straight mute, then back to open, that's not going to be practical for their intonation. They're not going to, I mean, they'll do it, but that causes problems. The mutes make the trumpet quieter. That's why they were designed in the first place. Think about the word mute. That's the word you use to, you know, make the TV shut up or whatever. It's the same language. When you put a mute into a trumpet, you're making it considerably softer than if they weren't playing with the mute. Don't mute the trumpets and then expect them to play a shout chorus. It's just not going to sound the way that you want it to. On that same note, when you're marking dynamics for trumpeters playing through mutes or anyone playing through a mute, the dynamic that you mark is the dynamic that you want to hear. So if the band is playing at mezzo piano and you've put your trumpet section in cup mutes, write MP on the trumpet section, and the trumpeters will know that they have to blow into their horn like a normal forte so that it sounds like MP through the cup mute. That's sort of common practice. And by that same note, it takes a considerable more effort to play through a mute than it does to play open, because so much of the sound is swallowed up by having something jammed into the end of your trumpet. So when having muted trumpet playing takes more of a toll on their endurance than playing regular unmuted trumpet, which is already tough on someone's endurance. So keep that in mind. If you're writing with mutes, make sure you're writing lots and lots of rests. Don't write trumpets in mute because you could just as easily not have trumpets at all. If you want the band to sound soft, think about not having the trumpets play at that point and giving them a rest. Use the mutes when you really want the timbre that the mutes create. Use the rest of the ensemble to kind of support that texture, as opposed to using the mutes as a crutch to make the trumpets quieter. That's not a useful use of your trumpeter's endurance. What else? That's enough. That's going to be about the end of part 1. Definitely, if you haven't hit it yet, hit subscribe. Man, I'll be your best friend. That's silly. Definitely check out my Patreon. And next time that we continue this, I'm going to have Robert Todd join me. And he is an excellent trombone player, trombonist. And he is going to bring over his mute selection. And we're going to talk about specific considerations for writing mutes for trombone. The silliest thing being how big they are, but we'll talk about that next time. In the meantime, definitely do those things we talked about before, and I will catch you soon. All right, goodbye.